In this episode, we're going to focus on a habit that protects your credibility and protects your organization at the same time, which is pressure testing your conclusions before they ever reach leadership. When you are new to intrusion analysis, it is easy to assume that your job is to find the answer and then present it confidently. In reality, the job is to find the most defensible understanding you can, identify what could be wrong about it, and make sure the story still holds when it is challenged. Leaders make decisions based on what you say, and those decisions can affect business operations, reputations, and people's trust in the security team. If your conclusion is weak, rushed, or shaped by assumptions you did not notice, it can cause overreaction, underreaction, or wasted effort in exactly the wrong direction. Pressure testing is how you reduce that risk, and it is a skill you can practice even when you do not have perfect data. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A strong pressure test begins with understanding why smart people reach bad conclusions during incidents, because the issue is usually not laziness or incompetence. Under stress, humans look for patterns quickly, latch onto the first story that makes sense, and then filter new information through that story. The louder an alert feels, the more we want closure, and closure makes us stop searching. In security work, closure can be dangerous because attackers thrive on defenders rushing to declare something contained, solved, or attributed. Another common cause is the mismatch between what you can observe and what you want to know, which tempts you to fill gaps with assumptions. None of this makes you a bad analyst. It makes you a human analyst, and the point of pressure testing is to build guardrails around normal human thinking. When you treat pressure testing as part of the work rather than an optional extra, you create space for accuracy even when the clock is loud. One of the simplest ways to start pressure testing is to separate observations from interpretations, because those two things often blur together in early analysis. An observation is something you can point to in data, like a suspicious outbound connection at a particular time, a new persistence mechanism, or an unusual login pattern. An interpretation is the meaning you attach to that observation, like the host is beaconing to command and control, or the attacker used stolen credentials. Interpretations can be correct, but they are always more fragile than observations, and leaders often hear interpretations as facts unless you are careful. Pressure testing means you revisit your interpretations and ask whether the observations truly support them or whether there are alternative explanations. For example, an outbound connection might be malicious, but it could also be a legitimate service change, a misconfiguration, or a benign tool behaving unexpectedly. If you cannot rule out the alternatives, you can still act, but you should communicate with calibrated confidence. Another practical pressure test is to look for disconfirming evidence, which means actively searching for signals that would contradict your current story. This is uncomfortable because it feels like you are trying to prove yourself wrong, but that is exactly why it works. If you believe initial access was a phishing email, you look for evidence that would contradict that, such as exploitation attempts against an exposed service or a login pattern that predates the reported email. If you believe the intrusion is limited to one host, you look for signs it is not, such as shared infrastructure contacts across multiple hosts or repeated authentication anomalies across different systems. If you believe the adversary is no longer active, you look for ongoing indicators like recurring beacons or new processes appearing after containment. The goal is not to endlessly doubt everything, but to make sure your conclusion survives contact with skepticism. When you can say you looked for contradictions and did not find them, your confidence becomes earned rather than assumed. Pressure testing also means checking your timeline logic, because many bad conclusions come from events being placed in the wrong order. Evidence often arrives out of sequence, and logs can be missing, delayed, or interpreted incorrectly. A typical failure pattern is to see a malware artifact and assume it caused everything that happened afterward, when it may have been dropped later as part of cleanup, distraction, or a secondary step. Another failure pattern is to treat the first alert you saw as the first action the attacker took, when the attacker may have been present long before detection. A timeline pressure test asks whether the story you are telling matches the earliest observed evidence, the latest observed evidence, and the gaps between them. If you have a gap where critical activity could have occurred, you should treat it as uncertainty, not as proof that nothing happened. Leaders do not need every detail, but they do need to know whether the timeline is solid or still forming. It helps to pressure test scope claims, because scope is where leadership decisions often become expensive. Saying an incident is isolated can lead to minimal disruption, while saying it is widespread can lead to sweeping resets, outages, and emergency processes. A scope pressure test asks what your conclusion is based on and what your visibility limitations are. If you claim only one host is affected, you should know whether you actually search for the same behaviors elsewhere and whether you have telemetry coverage that would reveal similar activity on other systems. If you claim the intrusion spread laterally, you should have evidence of movement, such as unexpected access paths or correlated host behaviors, rather than simply assuming it because the malware label sounds scary. If you claim sensitive data was accessed, you should be clear about whether you saw access events, saw evidence of collection, or only suspect exposure because the system hosts sensitive data. Being explicit about what you can prove protects you, and it protects leadership from making decisions on confidence that does not exist. Another critical pressure test focuses on causality, which is the difference between things that happen together and things that caused each other. Intrusions are noisy, and environments are noisy, and sometimes you will see unrelated events that line up in time. If you see a system update followed by an authentication failure spike, it might be attack activity, or it might be a configuration change. If you see a new process and a network connection, the process might be malicious, or it might be a legitimate service that simply became visible due to improved logging. Causality pressure testing means you ask what connects these events beyond timing. Do they share a common account, a common host, a common behavior pattern, or a clear dependency where one action enables the next? When you cannot establish a connection, you should avoid stitching events into a narrative just because it sounds coherent. Leaders often prefer a clear story, but a clear story that is wrong is worse than a careful story that admits uncertainty. Pressure testing is also about understanding how adversaries can manipulate your perceptions, because deception is not only for movies. Attackers may plant artifacts that point to another group, use publicly available tools to blur attribution, or trigger noisy events to distract defenders from the real objective. They may also leave behind a malware sample that looks sophisticated while the real compromise path was simple credential abuse. A pressure test asks whether your conclusion depends heavily on evidence that is easy to fake, such as file names, compiled timestamps, or superficial strings. It also asks whether you have anchored too strongly on a single source, like one alert type, one endpoint view, or one external report. If your story would collapse if that one source is wrong, you should treat the conclusion as fragile. The goal is not paranoia, it is resilience, so your analysis holds up even if the attacker tried to mislead you. You should also pressure test your assumptions about typical behavior, because the word typical can hide a lot of bias. Analysts sometimes assume a certain type of adversary always behaves a certain way, and then they interpret evidence to fit that expectation. They might assume ransomware always leads to encryption quickly, or that a certain type of campaign always includes certain tools, and then they overlook quieter steps that do not match the stereotype. A useful pressure test is to ask what you would conclude if you remove the labels from the evidence. If you did not know the suspected malware family name, what would the behaviors alone suggest? If you did not know who the victim organization is, what would the infrastructure and capability patterns alone suggest? This exercise helps you see when your reasoning is being pulled by expectations instead of evidence. Once you notice that pull, you can correct it by seeking more data or by lowering confidence in the parts of the story that rely on assumptions. Another strong pressure test is to evaluate how your conclusion changes the recommended actions, because conclusions that do not affect action may be overspecified. Sometimes analysts spend a lot of time refining details that do not matter to the decisions leaders need to make. If the leader's decision is whether to isolate a service, the key information is whether the service is at risk, whether disruption is acceptable, and whether containment alternatives exist, not the exact name of a tool used 2 steps earlier. A practical pressure test asks, if my conclusion is wrong in this specific way, would our course of action change, or would we still take the same protective steps? If the action would not change, You can simplify the conclusion and focus on what matters. If the action would change dramatically, you should invest more effort in validating that part of the story. This keeps your analysis aligned to outcomes, which is exactly what leaders need. Pressure testing also includes checking language discipline, because sloppy language can turn careful thinking into accidental overclaiming. Words like confirmed, proven, and attributed carry heavy weight, and if you use them casually, you create expectations you cannot support. On the other hand, words like maybe and possibly can sound like you do not know anything even when you have strong evidence. A pressure test asks whether your wording matches your evidence, and whether a reasonable listener would interpret your words the way you intend. If you say the attacker exfiltrated data, you should be prepared to explain what you observe that indicates exfiltration rather than mere access. If you say the intrusion is contained, you should be prepared to explain what containment means in scope and what residual risks remain. Calibrated language is not a style preference. It is a control, because it prevents your message from being misused or misremembered as stronger than it was. Another important part of pressure testing is peer challenge, even if it is informal, because other people see what you miss. A second set of eyes can question an assumption that you forgot you were making, or notice a conflicting data point that you dismissed too quickly. The goal of peer challenge is not to win an argument. It is to stress the conclusion until the weak parts reveal themselves. If you do not have a formal team review process, you can still practice the mindset by playing the role of your own skeptic and asking what a tough reviewer would question. You can also pressure test by explaining your conclusion out loud as if you were teaching it, because gaps in reasoning often become obvious when you try to make the story coherent. Leaders do not need to hear the internal debate, but they benefit when the conclusion has already survived that debate. Over time, teams that normalize challenge build better analysis and a healthier culture. When you pressure test well, you end up with a product that is both clearer and more honest, which might sound like a contradiction until you experience it. Weak conclusions often require lots of words to defend them, because they are trying to sound certain without strong support. Strong conclusions can be stated simply because they rest on multiple reinforcing observations and include clear boundaries around what is unknown. Pressure testing helps you strip away the parts of the story that are decorative and keep the parts that are defensible. It also helps you attach the right next questions, such as what additional evidence would raise confidence or what monitoring should be increased to catch a return. This is how you protect leaders from making decisions on shaky ground while still giving them what they need to act quickly. Clarity is not about being dramatic. It is about being sturdy. As we wrap up, pressure testing conclusions before they reach leaders is one of the most professional habits you can build in threat intelligence and intrusion analysis. It starts with separating observations from interpretations, then actively searching for disconfirming evidence, checking timeline logic, and validating scope and causality with discipline. It also includes awareness of deception, awareness of expectation bias, and careful language calibration so you do not accidentally overclaim. When you add peer challenge and action-focused thinking, your conclusions become both more useful and more trustworthy. Leaders will still need to make decisions under uncertainty, but your job is to make that uncertainty visible, bounded, and defensible instead of hidden behind confident storytelling. If you practice this every time, even on small incidents, you will build a reputation for analysis that holds up, and that reputation becomes one of the most valuable assets a security team can have.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.